Good morning, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for coming. These are the public hearings of the North Carolina Commission of Inquiry on Torture. I'm Catherine Reed, Executive Director of the Commission. We're delighted that you've joined us this morning and over the next 2 days as we learn about the rendition, detention, and interrogation program post 9/11 and North Carolina's role in that program. For those of you here in person, I have a few housekeeping items before I turn over to the Commission. The first is very important. Please silence your cell phones and take any conversations outside of the room if that's possible. This hearings are being recorded and webcast, and so we want to be as respectful as possible. Thank you. Please help yourselves to the coffee, water, tea at the back of the room. There will be a break at 11 o'clock for 15 minutes, and then an hour lunch break between 1 and 2, and today's testimony will conclude at 5 p.m. The restrooms are out of the door to the left, on the left, but if possible, please wait until changes between witnesses to move around or leave the room. We encourage you to submit questions for witnesses. Please write them on note cards. At the back of the room, there is a bowl for you to place them into. The commissioners will try and ask these. Given the time constraints, they won't be able to ask all of them, but we encourage you to submit them. You can also, if you're watching online, submit questions either on our website or tweet questions to @NCTorture. And throughout the proceedings, please share your reflections on social media using the hashtag #NCTorture. One of the witnesses will be speaking in Italian. We have a translator, so please bear with us during that testimony. She will also be speaking remotely, as will one other witness via Skype. Otherwise, everybody will be here in person. Your attendance here today tells us you're passionate and interested in this issue. Thank you. But please, no interruptions or disturbances during testimony today, or you will be asked to leave. In addition to submitting questions, you are all invited to stay for a cocktail hour, 5:30 to 6:30 after the proceedings today, where you will have an opportunity to meet and speak to the witnesses and the commissioners. For any additional questions, or if you'd like to speak to staff of the Commission, please come and find me, Catherine, Jess, if you'd stand, Jess Porter, and Christina Kauger. Please find us if you have anything else you'd like to say. Now I will go down the line of commissioners and allow them to introduce themselves before turning over to the co-chairs. David.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us in this very, very important occasion. I'm David M. Crane, the founding chief prosecutor of the International War Crimes Tribunal in West Africa called the Special Court for Sierra Leone.
I'm Lawrence Wilkerson. I extend greetings to you all too, and thanks for being here for this important hearing. I teach at the College of William and Mary in Virginia, the oldest public university in America. Most Americans don't know that. We still have the Queen come over for anniversaries and things.
Good morning, my name is Dr. Annie Sparrow. I'm a pediatric intensivist and public health specialist, and I'm heavily involved in the treatment of torture victims from most notably the Middle East and Syria. Thank you.
My name is Robin Kirk. I'm the co-director of the Duke Human Rights Center at the Franklin Humanities Institute. I teach human rights at Duke. I'm a former researcher with Human Rights Watch and a consultant to the Greensboro Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Good morning, I'm Jennifer Daskell. I'm a law professor at American University and Washington College of Law. I formerly worked at both the Department of Justice and the National Security Division, and prior to that I worked at Human Rights Watch as well on counterterrorism issues.
Good morning, my name is Frank Goldsmith. I am a lawyer, civil rights lawyer and mediator from the Asheville area. I have represented detainees at Guantanamo, and as a number of the other people are on this commission, I'm a military veteran as well.
Okay, I'm Patty McGaffigan. I'm a Johnston County resident, and I'm also a psychologist, and I am here very excited to see what's going to happen. Thank you for coming.
Good morning. My name is Jim Coleman. I'm a law professor at Duke. I teach criminal law and co-direct the Duke Wrongful Convictions Clinic.
I'm Jonathan Freeman. I'm a combat veteran of Iraq and Afghanistan and a former political appointee in the Obama administration. And thank you very much all for being here.
Good morning. Thank you for being here. I am Reverend Benjamin Boswell. I'm senior minister at Myers Park Baptist Church in Charlotte, North Carolina, former infantry officer in the North Carolina National Guard.
Good morning. My name is Jemana Kador. I'm a Syrian American. I've co-founded a Syrian organization that focuses heavily on the plight of Syrians, including detainees. And I'm also a lawyer, as many of the others on this panel.
Thank you, everybody. I'll now turn over to our co-chair, Jennifer Daskell. Thanks, Jennifer.
So it's to reiterate what Catherine said, it's really our pleasure to invite you all here today and to begin these proceedings. Frank and I are going to use our time briefly to put the Commission's work in context and explain the goals and the procedures of the next 2 days. As I think everyone here knows, in the aftermath of the September 11th, 2001 attacks, our nation launched at the highest levels of the government a program of torture and abuse with the asserted aim of gathering intelligence from those that threatened to do us harm or had done us harm. It's a program that ultimately implicated North Carolina as well. And we are here today to learn what happened, try to understand why it happened, prevent it from happening again, and account for the costs of the program, the human costs, the security costs, and the diplomatic costs. And this is particularly important at this moment in history. So I'm going to spend a few moments to describe a bit about what we know very briefly and how we know it. This is information that is all confirmed and come from a declassified executive summary of a Senate Intelligence Committee report. The rest of this report has not yet been released. A week after the September 11th attacks, President Bush issued a covert action memorandum authorizing the CIA to detain terrorists. A few months later, President Bush signed a memorandum later disagreed with by the U.S. Supreme Court, saying that the Geneva Conventions, including the humane treatment requirements included in the Geneva Conventions, did not apply to the conflict with al-Qaeda. The first detainee, Abu Zubaydah, was placed in CIA detention in June 2002. He was held in isolation, he was held incommunicado, and a few months later, the Department of Justice signed off on the use of proposed interrogation methods, including the use of waterboarding, which the United States had previously prosecuted as torture, prolonged sleep deprivation, use of stress positions, and other so-called enhanced, meaning abusive interrogation techniques. In 2002, November 2002, the first CIA detainee, Gul Roman, died in CIA custody. The initial torture memo was withdrawn in 2004, but many of the techniques that had been previously authorized were allowed to continue pursuant to a new report. In 2005, the first reports about what was going on began to leak out, including reports that North Carolina was also implicated because of the use of planes that took off and were connected to North Carolina, which Frank Goldsmith will talk about in a moment. In 2006, the Supreme Court disagreed with the Bush administration and held that the humane treatment requirements of Geneva bound the United States. This led to the first official acknowledgement of the CIA program, the CIA detention sites, and the transfer of the remaining detainees to Guantanamo. These were men who had been held in incommunicado detention for years. They were tortured. They were denied access to the International Committee for the Red Cross, let alone access to an attorney or family members. In 2009, 3 days after President Obama took office, he officially ended the program. In 2014, there was the official release of the Senate Intelligence Committee report's executive summary, as I referenced before, but the full report has never been made public. No one's ever been prosecuted for their actions. There's no compensation that has ever been given to the victims, and there's no full accounting of what happened beyond the Senate Intelligence Committee report, which, as I've said multiple times now, has never been made fully public. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Goldsmith. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So with that background, some North Carolinians became aware through national media exposure that North Carolina itself played a role in this rendition and detention and interrogation program. And that disturbed a lot of people. And so in 2005, an organization was formed that began to try to draw attention to North Carolina's role, primarily that role being through a company called Aero Contractors that was based in the Johnston County Airport near Smithfield, and also had a base near Kinston at the Global Trans Park. The activists formed an organization, North Carolina Stop Torture Now, and began engaging in actions to draw this situation to the attention of the public, and really more importantly to the attention of public officials. That was done by a variety of actions, including a media campaign, visibility actions, which included rallies and protests and some marches, a petition program to try to submit petitions to public officials, meetings with public officials to encourage them to take action about this situation that was occurring in North Carolina, and various other means. And so that effort to engage the attention of public officials was largely unsuccessful. Public officials did not seem to want to do anything about what seemed to be clear violations of federal and international and state law that were occurring in North Carolina. And so the idea began to be discussed of forming a commission, a truth commission, to investigate and create a record of this situation. And out of that was born this commission, the North Carolina Commission of Inquiry on Torture. The commission hired its staff first in 2015 and hired an executive director in 2016, and then the commissioners were approached and engaged to become part of this commission in early this year, in 2017. And so our purpose is to assemble the record on this program of rendition and detention and torture, to explore how it is connected to North Carolina, to try to create that record, and therefore to weigh the implications of this program for our state and for our nation, and to make findings and recommendations to public officials. So that's the purpose why we're here for these next 2 days, to receive that information and then later to form our findings and recommendations as a result of what we hear. So with that, do you want to talk about the objectives of our being here today?
Yes, thank you. So we have 3 key objectives over the next 2 days, and in the ultimate rating and production of a report, which is first transparency, to expose what happened, to educate the public, to make sure that this chapter in U.S. history does not get shrouded in secrecy. Second, accountability, both accounting of what happened, accounting of how it happened, accounting of the costs of what happened, both the human costs, the security costs, and the diplomatic costs. And third, we have a preventive goal to help through the process of transparency and hopefully some forms of accountability prevent these kinds of abuses from happening again. This is particularly important at this moment in time with political leadership that has at various points in time suggested an openness in thinking about returning to the use of torture.
So the way that we will proceed is that you will have in your, if you didn't pick one up, you should, we have a program that will have the agenda for the hearings. It has the names of the witnesses in it that are listed in alphabetical order. And it also has a list of people who were invited to come and give testimony to the commission, but who, for one reason or another, did not do that or did not respond to that request. We still invite their participation. We want to receive information from all sources. and we hope that that occurs even after these hearings conclude. So each of the witnesses will be called up separately and will give their testimony. After they have concluded their testimony, the commissioners will have an opportunity to ask questions of them. And as Catherine said earlier, if the audience has questions, if you would please write them down on the cards and pass them up to Catherine or Jess or Christina at the front here, then we will look those over and ask the questions. We will not try to ask every single question that is submitted because we have time constraints and we need to keep things moving along. I want to also tell you that the witnesses that have been asked to come here today, they've been asked to simply come and share what they know about the subject that's under consideration here, what they know about North Carolina's involvement in this program of rendition and torture. These are the witnesses' own statements. They are appearing voluntarily. They're not compelled, but we cannot compel them to testify. So they're here voluntarily and individually, and none of them are affiliated with the commission. So the testimony of these witnesses and their statements are their own and not that of the commission. We have also cautioned witnesses who may have had access in an official capacity to classified information, and I would like to turn to Commissioner Crane to say a word or two about that caution that has been issued.
Accountability and openness is very, very important, but we all as American citizens understand that information can be withheld from American citizens for national security purposes for appropriate reasons. Individuals today and tomorrow may have danced around or been involved in some of those classified situations. And so what we have done to ensure that we don't even come close to violating federal law and disclosure of classified information, have cautioned those witnesses who have been part of that to ensure that they review their testimony in any written product and only speak on the unclassified level. Even though it would be important to look at the classified aspects, we are not a government agency. We do not have a need to know this, and any discussion of classified information in this open hearing is a violation of federal law. And so we have taken great pains to make sure that we ensure that we don't back ourselves into a situation like that. So I just wanted to assure the audience as to what is going on related to the information that's being presented. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would now like to ask Commissioner Robin Kirk to address the context that we find ourselves in this program and these hearings.
Thank you. I'd like to add my thanks to everyone for coming. I just wanted to give a brief definition of torture, because this is what we see as the thing that we will be talking about a lot today. So I wanted to read that, and then also just talk about 5 things about torture that I think are important for us to keep in mind as we go forward for these 2 days. First, I wanted to read the definition of torture that appears in the Convention Against Torture, which the United States has ratified. Torture means any act by which severe pain or suffering, whether physical or mental, is intentionally inflicted on a person for such purposes as obtaining from him or a third person information or a confession, punishing him for an act he or a third person has committed or is suspected of having committed, or intimidating or coercing him or a third person, or for any reason based on discrimination of any kind, when such pain or suffering is inflicted by or at the instigation of or with the consent or acquiescence of a public official or other person acting in an official capacity. 5 things about torture which I think are important to keep in mind. Torture has been used for centuries. Torture is not new, neither are the justifications for torture. For centuries, people have claimed that they need to torture to obtain information, to punish the victim, to ensure compliance, including during slavery, that torture is, quote, scientific or applied within certain bounds. As the Roman jurist Ulpian said in the 3rd century AD, torture is a delicate, dangerous, and deceptive thing. Number 2, just as torture has been practiced for centuries, so too have people opposed the use of torture. It has been opposed for a number of consistent reasons. The information obtained through torture is unreliable at best, and at worst, false. Torture serves as an extra-legal punishment or execution method, and torture is a violation of moral, ethical, and religious tenets about how we treat other human beings. Number 3, torture is a body of knowledge, a practice and a set of procedures and tools that crosses time and culture. Just in the 20th century, torture was used by the United States in the Philippines against insurgents, by the French in Algeria against nationalists, by the Nazis against Jews, homosexuals, Roma, and the disabled, by the Argentine and Chilean juntas against dissidents, by the South African apartheid government against political opponents, and by the Egyptian authorities against their opponents. And this is just a short list. In fact, non-political torture, that is, the torture of people who are not suspected of any crime or who have been picked up in relation to common crime, remains by far the most common type of torture. Number 4, one of the most effective means of torture is not what you see on TV or in the movies. Psychological torture, and we'll be talking a fair amount about that today, including isolation and threats, mock executions of the victims or of their loved ones, can have lifelong and devastating effects. And finally, I think this is the most important point for us today. Torture can be stopped. Countries where torture used to be commonplace, including Germany, Argentina, Chile, the United Kingdom, South Africa, to name a few, have virtually eradicated torture and have established clear penalties for people who commit torture. But the only way this can effectively be done is by examining, as we are going to be doing for these 2 days, how torture works, how it took place, under what justifications and pressures, and then adopting specific, robust, and permanent measures to prevent torture from recurring. And finally, I would just like to say, I think we on this dais, as well as the people who did so much work in organizing today's events, are holding a special place in our hearts and in our minds today for the victims of torture and their friends and families who will be speaking to us today and who, as importantly, will be listening to us today. Torture is corrosive and far-reaching. And on behalf of myself and the commissioners, I would just like to say, we hear you, we see you, and we will not forget.
Thank you. Now, we're going to start with our witnesses, and I'd like to invite our first witness, Dr. Sam Raphael, to come and sit.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. Can you hear me at the back? It's working okay? No? Okay, that's a bit better. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you to the commissioners for inviting me. Thank you to Christina and all the others, Jess and Caroline, for all of the hard work that's been put into bringing this important meeting together, this set of hearings. I'm over from London for this. I think it's one of the most inspiring, important and vital efforts that I've seen in many years to bring some form of accounting and accountability. And I'm going to talk about accounting and establishing the truth, establishing the facts of what happened as part of the CIA torture program, as well as North Carolina's role within that. I'm a senior lecturer in international relations at the University of Westminster in London, and I'm also co-director of the Rendition Project, which is an academic-led project with my colleague, Professor Ruth Blakely, and I, who we've been working for 5, 6, 7 years now on trying to map the torture program, trying to piece together the fragmentary evidence of where the torture took place, who was tortured, who did the torture, how people were moved, and who was complicit in all of that. And we've been honoured to be able to work with a wide range of activists, of lawyers, of journalists, of scholars, of students, of citizens, who have all in their various ways contributed to the emerging understanding of what took place. So my testimony touches on three things. As I'm going first, I thought I would set out the broad contours of the torture program, making sure I don't repeat what's already been said in the preliminary speeches. Then talk about the rendition project and the ways in which we've approached our research and our key findings, before coming on to talk about the role of ERA contractors in particular. So the torture program, obviously I could spend hours detailing the exact historical evolution, geographic scope, and human impact of the torture program, but others will touch on that throughout the next 2 days. So just to very broadly be clear that this was a global kidnap, that's what it was, a kidnap, a secret detention, and a torture program, which operated from the weeks immediately after 9/11, ramped up in 2002, and then especially in 2003, and ran all the way through to January 2009, although it was mainly wrapped up by September 2006. And in theory, the program was focused on the identification, the targeting, and the capture, and the interrogation of so-called high-value detainees, i.e. those who had a direct role in the attacks on 9/11, or were planning further attacks, or presented a serious and continuing threat to the United States. But in reality, as many of us will know, many who were swept up within the program posed little or no threat to the United States. Many innocent people pulled in. And it was a detention program that ran far wider than the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. This was a kidnap program, a detention program, and a torture program which stretched truly globally across 4 continents, way beyond the geographic scope of the armed conflicts. And there were 3 main elements in the torture program that I tend to think of. The first, secret detention. The second, rendition. And the third, torture. And I'm going to talk a bit about secret detention and then go on to talk mainly about rendition. So, secret detention. What does secret detention mean? Secret detention is where somebody is detained by a detaining authority who either refuses to acknowledge that they're holding that person, or refuses to confirm or deny, or straight out denies, or acknowledges that they're holding that person, but refuses to give information as to their fate and whereabouts. It's the detention itself which is secret. Now, secret detention can take place in locations that aren't secret. They can take place, in prisons which are acknowledged to exist. Secret detention can take place in ad hoc facilities. They can take place in cars, in hotel rooms, on board ships. It can take place in secret wings to prisons which are acknowledged to exist, underground floors, wings that aren't acknowledged. And secret detention can take place in facilities which themselves are kept secret, so-called secret prisons. And in the context of the torture program, CIA detention, secret detention, took place in a number of contexts. The first being black sites. Black sites were built by the CIA and contractors. They were run by the CIA, and they housed detainees that were in sole custody by the CIA black sites. But secret detention also took place in military facilities, be it in Iraq or Afghanistan, where the CIA kept so-called ghost prisoners and circulated them around, often rotated the prisoners around when the International Committee for the Red Cross came to visit a military facility such as Bagram or Abu Ghraib. And thirdly, CIA secret detention took place in proxy or foreign detention facilities. And that would be either for the initial detention When somebody had been kidnapped, they might be held by a foreign security force before being rendered into CIA detention, CIA black sites, or people were rendered from CIA black sites into proxy detention facilities, then back to black sites, or when the CIA had finished with a particular person, they would sometimes be rendered to the Egyptians, or the Libyans, or the Moroccans, or the Jordanians, and so forth. And in some cases, which I'll come on to talk about, prisoners, and the Senate report doesn't mention these people, there were some prisoners who never made it into the CIA black site network. They were simply picked off the street and rendered by the CIA directly to a foreign government or security service in North Africa or the Middle East, predominantly. There were 10 black sites known to have operated, at least. There were 4 in Afghanistan, plus a collection of safe houses and informal locations used on a temporary basis. There were 3 in Eastern Europe, 1 in Poland, in an old military intelligence facility, 1 in Romania, in downtown Bucharest, and 1 in Lithuania, in an old horse riding academy. There was a CIA black site in Thailand. The first to be operational was in Thailand. And there were 2 facilities which operated alongside the military facility at Guantanamo Bay. So CIA detainees were rendered to Guantanamo, not kept with the rest of the prisoners, not declared to the ICRC, but kept in a CIA facility at Guantanamo before, when it became apparent that the US law would reach Guantanamo detainees, they were spirited back out again and disappeared back into the other black sites. But these black sites, as I'm intimating, didn't exist in isolation from one another. They were connected, and prisoners were moved between them by rendition flights. Now, rendition is the transfer of an individual between states, between legal jurisdictions outside of the law. So in contrast to extradition or deportation, which is a legal process where you have a right to appeal and so on and so forth, rendition exists outside of the law in that sense. And the CIA used private jets to move prisoners between secret prisons. And many individuals were subject to multiple renditions. Some prisoners were rendered 5 times, 6 times, 7, 8. One man was rendered 9, maybe even 10 times between these black sites. And people were often rendered in groups. And that would occur as one prison was closed down. The prisons didn't all operate at the same time, but the system evolved temporarily. And as some sites were shut down, others were opened up, and the detainees were shuffled between them on these flights. That's an account, a first-hand account by Mohammed Bashmallah of his rendition from Jordan to Afghanistan, which is too small to be read here, but I'm gonna read it anyway. I was driven for about 30 minutes to the airport. At the airport, I was pulled from the car and placed in a room. I was seated on a chair with my hands still in cuffs and my blindfold still on. Very shortly thereafter, I was taken violently to another room where my clothing was rapidly cut off until I was entirely naked. My blindfold was taken off, and strong light beams were directed at my face while someone put their hand over my eyes. I was not able to see clearly because of this, but I could see some things in the room by peeking through the fingers of the hand over my face. There were at least 3 people there. One of them was the one holding me from behind and covering my eyes with his hand. I didn't see the person holding me, but the other 2 that I did see were dressed head to toe in black, with black masks covering their faces and surgical gloves on their hands. They beat me and kicked me, roughing me up badly. Another person took pictures of me, and then one of them forcefully stuck his finger into my anus. I was in severe pain and began to faint. After this ordeal, I was put into a diaper like a baby and dressed in a blue shirt and pants that came below the knee to about the mid-shin. Both the shirt and the pants had been cut to about 3/4 length and were made of sweatshirt material. I was forced to go without shoes. They stuffed my ears with spongy material and taped all around that before putting headphones on. They blindfolded me, by putting dressing, like he would on a wound, over my eyes and then taping over it. Later, this tape was painfully removed, and with it clumps of my hair. They tied my legs together and chained them to my waist. Then they tied my hands together and also chained them to my waist. I was also hooded. I was in a lot of pain at this time, but I was mostly worried about my mother and wife because I did not know what was happening to them. I was taken up 6 or 7 steps to get on board a plane where I was forced to lie on my back. I was then strapped across the chest and legs to a metallic board which was like a hospital gurney. This plane travelled for about 4 hours before landing. During the flight, I suffered pain in my head, sides and knees from blows and kicks from the men who prepared me for the transfer and forced me onto the plane. Now, I think it's worth me reading that out because it not only shows the human cost of rendition, it not only shows that rendition itself is a form of torture, but also because when you read and listen to the testimony from those who were rendered, their stories time and again are the same. There was a standard operating procedure. There was a small team of CIA personnel dressed all in black with what some described as ninja masks covering their faces, who communicated only using hand signals, and who initiated a rough takedown of detainees, including stripping them naked, beating them, photographing them, inserting suppositories into their anuses, dressing them back up, shackling them, hooding them. Everything that Bashmillah described happened to scores and scores of men. And the human cost of that, when we've heard the voices from those who've suffered that process, are very clear. Now, moving on to the kind of structure of the rendition program. It appears to be that there were 2 branches to the CIA rendition program. The first were a fleet of CIA-owned aircraft. The aircraft were registered to so-called shell companies, that is, companies that did not exist other than for the purposes of legal registration of the aircraft. Here are 2 shell companies which were the nominal owners of the 2 aircraft on the right at various points in time. Many of you will be familiar with these 2 aircraft. These are the 2 aircraft that have been linked to multiple renditions and that flew out of airports in North Carolina. So you had shell companies. But then the aircraft were actually operated by real companies with close ties to the CIA. And key here, of course, is aero contractors, as has already been mentioned, which many suggest is essentially a CIA arm. There's not much daylight between aero contractors and the CIA, it appears. And according to the New York Times, in one of the early investigations, the CIA operated at least 26 aircraft owned by 7 shell companies. Now, not all of these have been shown to have been involved in rendition operations, because of course these fleet of aircraft would have been used for a wide range of intelligence functions. But certainly from within this fleet, and certainly these 2 aircraft now, with strong North Carolina collections, there is indisputable evidence that they were involved in the rendition of Bashmillah and many others. So, N379P was a Gulfstream 5 executive jet which operated out of Johnston County Airport. And N313P was a much larger aircraft, a Boeing 737, which operated out of Kinston Regional Airport. Both of these were re-registered once, and in the case of 379P twice, were re-registered during their period of operation with the CIA in order to maintain operational secrecy, in order to thwart investigators who had begun to clock that these aircraft were up to no good and violating international law. And most of the circuits, the rendition circuits, undertaken by these 2 aircraft were arranged by a third company called Jeppesen Data Plan, which is a subsidiary of Boeing. Now, Jeppesen's role in this was to act as what's called a trip planner. A trip planner is a company that organizes on behalf of aircraft of pilots and of aircraft operating companies the logistics of a series of flights. So they'll organise the overflight rights, they'll organise the landing permits, they'll organise refreshments, and so on and so forth. Now, the second branch of the rendition program was contracted out. So it wasn't using aircraft owned by the CIA, it was using aircraft contracted through, at the top, the prime contractors with the defense company DynCorp, which was later bought by Computer Sciences Corporation, CSC. But that was at the top of a kind of dense corporate network of brokers and sub-brokers and operators that ran, between them, kind of a dozen or so aircraft, 15 or so aircraft that we've linked to rendition operations. And throughout all of this, the secrecy, operational secrecy, was central. So you had the shell companies, of course, used to disguise real ownership. You had even the use of civilian aircraft was to maximize secrecy, because civilian aircraft can fly without notification across state boundaries. You have the changing of the tail numbers. You have filing of false flight plans to hide destinations, particularly flights that landed in black site locations where the secret prisons were held. The flights were often flown without a flight plan, so the air traffic authorities weren't notified of its true destination. Aircraft occasionally met in third locations, and prisoners were transferred from one aircraft to another to ensure that two black site destinations weren't linked by one flight. This was a tactic that was used increasingly towards the end of the program. When investigators had kind of clocked on to what was happening, the CIA upped its game. And there are also examples where the CIA worked with local customs or border officials to ensure that records were falsified or that no records of landings were kept. So that's the kind of, the broad structure of the secret prison network, and then the rendition flights and the companies that operated to connect those together. The second thing I want to do is just to talk briefly about my work and our findings, our key findings. I mean, the rendition project is designed to build as detailed a picture of what took place in the torture program and of the fate and whereabouts of all those held by the CIA or rendered by the CIA. And it appeared to me when I started to research this in about 5 years ago, that although there was a fantastic amount of investigative work that had been carried out, and although there were great efforts to represent victims of torture and rendition, there was no one place which brought together all of the information and all of the data in order to establish to the fullest extent possible exactly what happened at a kind of programmatic level, at an overall level. And in particular, the rendition project has spent a long time tracking the aircraft which were used for the renditions between the CIA black sites and between the black sites and foreign partners for secret detention and torture. And in this, we've worked with a range of other investigators to compile flight data. Lots of outfits, including here, the North Carolina Stop Torture Now has done fantastic work in ensuring that flight data relating to CIA aircraft were released. Human Rights Watch has done important work. Reprieve has done important work. I'm not going to go on and name everyone because I'll of course miss somebody out. But there was we began our project knowing that and appreciating that many others had kind of trodden the path and had blazed the trail beforehand to identify which aircraft were involved and to begin to compile their movements. But what we've done is to pull together what's undoubtedly the largest public database of CIA or flights by aircraft associated with the CIA program. We have more than 11,000 flights in our database by more than 200 aircraft. Now, for inclusion in the database, what it required was that an aircraft had been identified by a prior investigation as potentially having some involvement with the torture program. Now, what that means is that there are many aircraft in the database that undoubtedly do not have anything to do with the program. And of course, because some of the aircraft were contracted out, there are many flights by rendition aircraft in the database that were not part of specific rendition operations. But what the database does have within it are the details of multiple specific rendition operations. And the key for us was to take the flight data, which was often fragmentary, so you'd get some flight data from one authority in one jurisdiction, you get another letter from a FOI request from another aviation authority in another jurisdiction. It would all be piecemeal and fragmentary. And what we did was pull it all together and build the individual flights into circuits, which allow the full picture of aircraft movements to emerge. This is just a few examples of some of the flight data as it came to us and to other investigators that we worked with. Here's a billing invoice from Richmore Aviation. Here is a letter from the Polish Border Guard office detailing flights by N379P into the airport which serviced the CIA black site in Poland. And once we had the flight data in that format, we then triangulated this with a range of other information, which then further enables us to identify particular circuits as rendition operations. So if we know the locations of the black sites, if we know the exact dates that they were operational from, if we know where individual prisoners were held, if we know the dates that they were moved, we can start to match that information with the flight database. And where there is a positive correlation, we have a strong suggestion that the aircraft rendered that individual. And since 2015, we've worked with the Bureau of Investigative Journalism to analyze the information contained in the executive summary, the redacted version of the executive summary of the Senate report. Which the Senate report has a lot of information in it and a lot of information that's not in it. And one of the things that the Senate report doesn't deal with is the part of the overall program which concerned renditions or proxy detention. The Senate report, or the executive summary that's been released, the remit of the investigation was the black site program directly. And many of the details within the report, within the executive summary, are redacted. In particular, the dates for particular kidnaps, the dates for particular movements, the dates that people were transferred from site to site, and the locations. And with each of the black sites in the report is given a pseudonym, it's given a colour. So the black site in Poland, for example, was referred to as detention site blue, whereas the black site in Romania was referred to as detention site black throughout the report. But in many cases, it has been possible, we've found, to reverse engineer the redactions. So if we can triangulate the information in the Senate report with prisoner testimony, with other declassified government documents, and with flight data, we can start to, in effect, peel back some of the redactions to reveal the exact locations, to reveal the exact dates on which people were moved, and so build a denser and richer picture of the overall program. I'm just going to skip over that. So what we have been able to do so far is to conclusively link 19 separate aircraft to rendition operation. We have identified more than 60 specific rendition circuits between September 2001 and September 2006. 60 rendition circuits we've been able to connect to the rendition of more than 110 individual renditions. So that's kind of where we've got to so far. But to note also that we have in our database a number of so-called suspicious circuits, so circuits that connect known black site destinations during their period of operation, but where we thus far have no prisoner match. We can't identify the prisoner that was moved at that time, which suggests that there may be additional prisoners, that there may be people who were not acknowledged in the Senate report. The Senate report acknowledged 119 detainees. We know that the true figure was definitely higher. The Senate report, in fact, stated that the records were kept so badly by the CIA, was undoubtedly be more. But of course, because the Senate report doesn't deal with rendition to foreign detention, there were certainly more people who were rendered on board CIA aircraft. And we also have a number of prisoner transfers that we know of, but we can't find the connecting flight, which suggests the possibility or the likelihood of additional aircraft. I mean, we're not there. We haven't got the global picture, of course. So, all of this comes now down to the role of aero contractors. And of course, the involvement of aero contractors runs deep. We know this. That's why we're here. I'm going to talk a little bit, try to scope out what we now know about the involvement of aero contractors' aircraft, in particular, in rendition operations. What we have in the first 3 years, or 3 years of the program, are over 800 flights by the 2 aircraft I mentioned in our database. And within this, landings, hundreds of landings at key locations. Now, by key locations, I mean locations where we know that prisoners were kidnapped, locations where we know that black sites operated, locations where we know that proxy detention facilities operated, locations that we know were used for the refueling of these jets as they traveled around the world. Especially 379P, it's a small jet, it can't travel, it travels across the Atlantic and needs to land for fuel. Locations that we know were used by CIA crew for rest and relaxation after or during rendition operations. There is, in some cases, people have found kind of hotel records at luxury hotels in islands in the Atlantic, in the Azores, for example, Mallorca, where CIA crew kind of put their feet up after rendering individuals to torture. We know that aero contractors' aircraft carried out more renditions than any other aircraft. It really was at the center of the CIA program. In fact, in the first few years of the program, 80% of the renditions that we have identified were on board these 2 aircraft. We've identified 32 separate circuits by these 2 aircraft that have rendered 49 individual prisoners to torture. We know we've identified that at least 34 of the 119 listed by the Senate report were rendered by aero aircraft. That's more than a quarter. We've identified at least 15 more that were rendered to proxy detention or to US military detention on board these aircraft. Here's a typical circuit. The aircraft starts at the home base, in this case Johnston County. It flies to Washington to pick up the CIA rendition team. They then fly cross-Atlantic, stopping for refueling or perhaps for overnight. In this instance, they stopped in Prague. They then fly to the pickup location, in this instance Kabul in Afghanistan, where they picked up Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who would have undergone the rendition procedure that Bashmillah outlined. Sheikh Mohammed would have flown to Poland, in this case, but the aircraft filed dummy flight plans, suggesting that it was actually flying to Budapest or Warsaw. But in reality, it landed at Shamani, at the small airstrip which serviced the black site. So it would in reality fly to the drop-off location where Khalid Sheikh Mohammed would have been unloaded. Once he was in the site in Poland, he was waterboarded. He was subjected to the most horrific torture, including the use of the waterboard over 15 separate occasions, at least 183 times. He was brought, in the words of one interrogator, to the verge of death and back again, deliberately, and on multiple occasions. After leaving the prisoner, the crew would fly again for refueling and for, quotes, rest and relaxation, this time in Glasgow, then return to Washington to drop the CIA team, and then return to Johnston County. That's a typical rendition circuit carried out by an aero contractor's aircraft. Here are a bunch more. And as I say, we've identified more than 30 individual circuits like this, which rendered at least 49 individuals to torture. We have Aero involved in rendition from capture locations to the black sites. We've identified at least 32 of the prisoners held in black sites that were captured in locations outside of Pakistan and Afghanistan. So captured kind of in global locations. And of these, more than 2/3 were rendered to the black site network on board Aero contractors' aircraft. We have multiple renditions to the black sites in Afghanistan, at least 17 detainees that we can pin to Aero aircraft flying into Afghanistan, in particular to the prison known by the prisoners themselves as the dark prison. And when you read the accounts of the dark prison, you know why it's called the dark prison. There was literally no light. People were held in complete darkness for months, if not years on end. The guards would walk around the cells and the corridors with head torches on and not speak to the detainees. They'd beat them up, they wouldn't speak to them. The detainees it wasn't silent though, the detainees were subjected to continuous white noise. Kind of static noise, like but very loud all the time. Or to Halloween noises. Or to rock music. Apparently Bruce Springsteen's Born in the USA was a favourite, which I like to think is a kind of form of double torture, but there you go. We have multiple renditions to the black site in Poland. At least 5 detainees that were rendered to Poland were rendered on board Aero contractors' aircraft. We know Sheikh Mohammed, I've discussed, Bin Attash, al-Baluchi, al-Barq, al-Jaziri. Many of whom, or some others of these, we have evidence of their pretty horrific torture while in this prison. We have multiple renditions to the black site in Romania. At least 7 detainees taken to Bucharest for secret detention on board Aero aircraft. We have multiple renditions to the proxy detention facilities, such as Morocco. I mean, each one of these people, like I'm going through this because we don't have time, and we'll hear from, across these next 2 days, we'll hear more and more some of the personal human accounts and stories. Each of these people that's a bullet point on a list, on a slide in a room here, is a person that went through a horrific experience. And many of the names, some of the names on this list, we don't know much more about them other than their names on this list, and they were on these aircraft at these times. We've been able to piece together forensically where people were and when they were captured and in what places they were held. And we've been doing that by a whole bunch, like sitting with, tens of thousands of data points. And, I kind of think of like a constellation where you're just drawing lines to work it out. But it's so important to always come back to the point that every journey is a human. Every journey is somebody like you and I. That has been, and for those where we have been able to connect humanly and have heard their experience, that's the central point. That's what's most important. Not bullet points on a slide. But nevertheless, bullet points on a slide that kind of reiterate the scale and the kind of indisputable connection between North Carolina, Aero contractors, these aircraft, these pilots and crew on board, and the men who were rendered. If there was one bullet point on one list on one slide, you could start to quibble with the strength of the evidence. You could start to suggest alternative explanations for the data. When you have the picture is so dense and rich and confirmatory, nothing within this contradicts. It all makes sense. When you connect the dots in these ways, it's obvious that there's no other way to connect the dots. And that's what's so powerful about this type of enterprise. That it's then undeniable that it took place and it happened. And of course within this kind of following on, is just that point, that this was rendition that was outside the law, this was rendition that in itself was a form of torture and inhumane treatment, but it was also rendition to torture. So I'm just going to give you a kind of, this is my last piece, I'm going to just an illustrative account of some of the men who were on board these two aircraft and what happened. So you had Madney, who was rendered to Egypt in January 2012, where he was kept in a grave-like underground cell measuring 6 feet by 4 feet for 92 days and subject to electric shock torture. You had Binyam Mohammed, who was rendered by aero aircraft to proxy detention in Morocco. He was then further rendered by aero aircraft back into CIA detention in Afghanistan. But in this case, he was rendered to Morocco, where he was held for more than a year, or a year and a half, where he was threatened with rape and subject to extensive beatings and genital mutilation. Every time he was interrogated, his penis was cut with a razor blade. You have Hassan bin Attash, who was rendered to proxy detention in Jordan in September 2002, where the soles of his feet were thrashed until they were raw before he was placed on a pile of half-melted salt. You had al-Nashiri, Abd al-Rahim al-Nashiri, who was rendered to the black site in Thailand in November 2002, where he was kept naked and shackled, was threatened with sodomy and with the arrest and rape of his family. He was also waterboarded at this site. I've spoken about Khalid Sheikh Mohammed already. You have Walid bin Attash, Hassan bin Attash's brother, who was rendered to the site in Poland in June 2003, where he was subjected to 110 hours of sleep deprivation. I mean, that's something to say about Khalid Sheikh Mohammed as well. He was subjected to more than 7.5 days of continual sleep deprivation. 7.5 days straight. And you know, some of the techniques that were used are clearly, on the face of it, horrific. Some of them appear to be a little milder, and one might be forgiven for thinking, well, isn't that torture really? But when you appreciate the extent to which they're used, and the fact that these techniques were used in conjunction with one another, that stress positions were employed for weeks on end, painful stress positions that if we were in now, if we stood up and put ourselves into a position like that, within 2 minutes, our muscles would be screaming. People were held there for weeks in those positions, alongside sleep deprivation for days on end, which drives you mad, so I've been told, drives you mad, with sensory deprivation, not seeing natural sunlight for months on end, with sensory overload, these noises and these sounds that did not stop ever. You kind of combine them all together. Dietary manipulation, the refusal of the use of food, but instead being fed kind of a liquid nutritional drink. The use of, in some cases, rectal rehydration, it was called, without medical necessity. That is a form of sexual assault. It's the insertion of food forcibly through the anus. So one detainee lunch kind of consisted of nuts and hummus and so forth, was pureed and inserted rectally with no medical necessity. You have al-Qasimi, who was rendered to the dark prison in Afghanistan into August 2003, where he was subjected to severe physical and psychological torture, including by being suspended with his arms above his head for extended periods of time and beaten with electric cables. The dark prison was run by the CIA. It wasn't being shipped over to another security service. This was torture done by the CIA. And lastly, Bashmilar, who we've heard from before, describing his rendition to Afghanistan from Jordan in October 2003, where he was shackled to the wall and kept in a diaper that was worn during the rendition for an extended period of time, I think for weeks on end, and blasted with excruciatingly loud Western rap and Arabic music, and became so depressed that he attempted suicide on 3 separate occasions. I've been told that I need to wrap that up, which is good, because I'm nearly there. So, I've kind of tried to, I hope this has been okay, I've kind of tried to strike the kind of balance between outlining the kind of cold data that has emerged through the kind of unstinting efforts of a group of incredible people who have sought to investigate the kind of facts of what happened during the torture program. And our modest effort as the Rendition Project to build on that and to bring as much of it together to enable kind of further insights to be made. So to kind of balance that on the one hand with the kind of human reality of the program and the human impact of the program, which of course must remain central to all of us. So I think that can be my conclusion. Thank you very much.
So do any commissioners, first of all, have questions for Dr. Raphael?
David Crane.
Dr. Raphael, as I'm sitting here as an American, I just leaned over to my colleague and said, where did we learn these techniques? This is not what we've done in the past. We started this after 2001. Where did this come from? How did we learn these horrific torture techniques? Do you know, or can you give us a thought?
Well, I know that the so-called enhanced interrogation techniques that were authorized in the infamous torture memos by the Department of Justice were originally developed as kind of counter-resistance techniques by the US military to resist torture if personnel had been kind of captured by dastardly enemies. But I also know that that's kind of the immediate precursor, but then there's also a long history, actually, of the connection between torture and democracy. And there's a long history of the use of, in particular, clean torture techniques, techniques that do not leave physical scars, techniques like sensory deprivation, sensory overload, stress positions, by a range of democracies, including the United Kingdom during its colonial period and post-colonial period at the end of empire, and including by the United States through kind of proxy forces in Latin America in the 70s and 80s. So, in one sense, yes, this current manifestation emerged as a reaction to, or as a response to 9/11. It has a particular historical starting point, but in another sense, I feel like it would be doing history a disservice to say that it all started then. Would be my answer, yeah.
No, fair enough, thank you.
Other questions from commissioners? Commissioner Kirk.
Thank you very much. You talked about the way you collated data. Could you talk more about the people who were also involved in collecting data, like eyewitness data of like plane spotting or other things? Can you talk about how you, like what percentage of, or not percentage, but what part of the data was forensic, like documents that you were able to collect versus seeing planes landing? Like how do you collate that human intelligence that you might have had?
Okay, I mean, you've kind of mentioned kind of plane spotters, as it were, or I'd say that to be what you mean. The role of plane spotters was key. I mean, by this I mean men, I'm guessing mainly, men standing on the perimeters of airports with binoculars, kind of noting down and logging aircraft as they kind of landed and took off from various airfields around the world, and noticing something was up, noticing something was strange was happening, and talking to each other and building up a picture of, you can, once you have, well, the interesting thing is, once you have the tail numbers, you can begin to request information from public authorities. They sometimes give it to you, they sometimes don't. Paradoxically, the FAA in the US has been fantastic. I mean, I found them fantastic in terms of giving the data. The United Kingdom, we've privatised the air traffic service, National Air Traffic Service in the UK, which then puts it outside of FOI law, so it's much harder to get data. But once you have the tail numbers, you can, now you've got something to work with. Now we can build up a picture of the movements of these aircraft. Finding the tail numbers at the first place requires, of course, it requires a different technique. And that was, the role played by amateur plane spotters in that was key, I think, initially, in putting that up. But in terms of my work, has been working mainly with data on aircraft tail numbers that had already been identified and kind of sifting through that.
Thank you. So we have a question from the audience, Dr. Raphael. During your research, were you able to find out the actual flight crew or pilots that flew the planes? Presumably their identities, I think is the question.
Yeah, okay. So in the data that we hold does not include crew names and crew identities. I know that there have been journalists that have, I think the story is that there were police investigations in Europe that compiled crew lists on the back of, for example, hotel records, and that some of those lists were leaked to journalists, and some of those journalists were able to establish the true identities behind the aliases and reported that. It's a sensitive area, going back to your initial kind of warning, I guess, before this began. It's a sensitive area because, of course, my understanding of the US law is if you release the names of covert agents, that's an offence.
That is correct.
So I'm not about to do that.
Dr. Raphael, I have two questions. One, do you have a sense as to how many individuals would be involved in a particular flight? And particularly how many people working for aero contractors would be involved in a particular flight? And my second question is, you've talked a lot about the efforts that were taken to conceal the identities of the planes and their movements. So given that, how sure can you be that you've identified the right planes and that your reporting is accurate given the efforts to conceal the identities of the planes and their movements?
Okay, so in your first question first, I don't know the exact answer to that. I know that the CIA rendition teams that I understand to not be part of aero contractors numbered kind of between 6 and a dozen in any one operation. The aero was supplying the pilots, so I'd be guessing that would be 2 to 3 people per operation, as it were. Again, I don't have information as to the knowledge of the pilots regarding their mission, as it were, but it seems to me that they would have been at the operational briefing in Washington, that they were involved in the filing of false flight plans, and that they could have been under no illusion that they were carrying human cargo, and so that there must have been a good deal of knowledge from aero employees. In terms of whether, how certain can we be that these aircraft were involved? On one level there were attempts to keep the program secret. What's interesting is that the decisions were made at certain points to run it in particular ways, which made the maintenance of secrecy quite hard in practice. So for example, if the CIA had kept all its detainees in Afghanistan, all the black sites in Afghanistan, I think it would have been much harder to build a picture of what was happening. It was because they wanted to spread out the prisons geographically for purposes of secrecy, that actually it was just unsustainable. It's unsustainable to ferry prisoners on these aircraft around the world without at some point somebody realizing what was up. And when people question whether people question whether there could be an alternative explanation or an alternative interpretation of the data. And I'm sure of this than anything else, that there is only one, with the mass of data that there is, and the specificity of the correlations, right? When we know that a particular person was transferred from A to B on a definite date, on the 12th of April 2002, and we have the flight records that go from A to B on the same day, and that aircraft, and that same aircraft, we have exactly the same matches for multiple and multiple and multiple occasions, and we are as sure as we can be that this person was transferred from A to B. It just seems to me that of everything that we need to talk about in these next 2 days, the fact that aero contractors was deeply implicated is in my mind just not up for discussion.
Let me ask a question, Dr. Raphael, related to that. You've said that both of these aircraft, 313 and 379, were re-registered and assigned new tail numbers at least once, maybe twice in the case of one of the aircraft. Is there any legitimate reason for an aircraft operated by a given carrier to undergo a re-registration and reassignment of a tail number, or is it clear that the purpose in doing that was to evade detection and the identification of that aircraft as a CIA-operated or Aero-operated aircraft?
I mean, this may sound strange, but I'm not an aviation expert. So there are some points at which I would need to defer to somebody who is, but I myself cannot think of a legitimate reason for re-registering an aircraft that has been used for illegal operations to another shell company with a separate tail number in order to continue illegal operations. I cannot think of another rationale other than to maintain secrecy.
Okay. Yes.
In terms of the movement of prisoners in anticipation of visits by the International Committee of the Red Cross, do you have a sense of how many times that happened? I mean, in terms of being able to match up, because the ICRC, gives advance warning of its visits or requests visits, so you can presumably match up when the people were moved and correlate that with the dates of proposed visits.
So I know that one of the US government inquiries into the scandals at Abu Ghraib concluded that, quote, other government agencies, by which they mean the CIA, other government agencies kept detainees at Abu Ghraib and circulated them prior to or in anticipation of ICRC visits to that one prison. I know that the ICRC in early 2004 sent a letter to the US essentially calling it out and saying that they knew that the CIA were holding detainees in secret in Afghanistan and providing a list that was scarily complete, I think. This is in the Senate report. And as a consequence, that's one of the reasons why in kind of early mid-2004, the program was downsized. And a whole bunch of detainees most of whom had been languishing in the dark prison for months on end with no interrogations, no debriefing. They were just sitting there. And at that point, it kind of shook the CIA awake for a moment. And they kind of released a whole bunch of people. They sent a whole bunch to Bagram for continued detention under the US military. But I do know as well that, I mean, just moving beyond the ICRC, that there's one can map the evolution of the black sites by not only the kind of interaction with the Red Cross, but also with in anticipation of the presence of black sites in particular jurisdictions becoming public. That when a reporter, when the Washington Post works out that there's a black site in Thailand, and the Thai government works out that the Washington Post has worked out that there's a black site in Thailand, that the Thai government starts to get itchy starts to withdraw consent, and the CIA at that point needed to find somewhere else. And the same happened at the end of 2005, when the first reports came out from the Washington Post that there were Eastern European states used to host black sites, but they wouldn't name them. Human Rights Watch straight away named them as Poland and Romania. And at that point, you can see in the system, when you start to look at who's moved where, that quickly these two sites were closed down, and the detainees kind of spread throughout the system, throughout the network, including to the kind of relatively new prison in Lithuania. So this is kind of like shifting, as the light is shone, it kind of shifts itself, the program, to remain in the dark.
Thank you. I think Commissioner Freeman has a question.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Raphael. I was wondering if you could explain or expand on the nature of the differentiation between Aero being a front company vis-a-vis a specific contractor, and then you mentioned DynCorp, but of course DynCorp split in terms of CSC and then became DynCorp International and sold to Cerebus, which of course has become more involved, shall we say, in some government conversations, so could be very relevant for any future findings. So I was wondering if you could expand on that, please, if you can.
So my understanding is that Aero Contractors has the same status as a company such as Richmore Aviation, in that it is a real corporate entity with real staff and a real structure, real premises, that actually operates the aircraft, actually ensures that they're serviced, that they're fueled, that they're piloted, etc. And that I mentioned the two branches of the program, and with the kind of the CIA-owned branch, Aero Contractors seems to have formed the kind of central player in that, in actually ensuring that the aircraft are flying and that the operations can take place. Now, there's a question, and I know that others in the room here have done a whole bunch of great work to kind of around the relationship between Aero and the CIA, and there's the kind of question over how independent Aero is, and should we really be thinking of it as an independent corporate entity or not. Whereas the other side, the kind of DynCorp side, really seems to have been a kind of a network of corporations that operated at different levels, either by kind of operating the aircraft, finding the operators who would operate the aircraft, so brokering between the prime contractor and then the CIA and the aircraft, and there were a good number of companies kind of within that contracting tree that we've been able to piece together, not least through paperwork that was released in court in 2011 between two of the companies involved, that one was suing the other for breach of contract.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we appreciate very much your testimony, Dr. Raphael, and I think now we can move on to the next witness.